whether something is biased, which we're talking about sort of just an inclination or preference for another individual, or we're talking about hate, which is an extreme dislike, you can report both. So whether you feel as though it's biased or whether you feel that it rises to the level of hate, and often you'll hear us say hate bias. So we'll actually take both incidents and you can report both, whether it feels very much like this might just be bias and this is, let's say, someone engaged in a microaggression. Maybe they didn't use a slur, but they said something that was offensive. You can report that. Or an extreme dislike when based on someone's identity, which often involves maybe hate incidents or hate crimes, you can report that as well. What I wanted to really tease apart is what is the difference between hate bias and discrimination, particularly on our campus. As you know, we also have the Office of Civil Rights and Sexual Misconduct, and they handle discrimination complaints. And sometimes people will make reports to us that's discriminations or report to them that's hate bias. And so a lot of times when we're talking about discrimination, there is often an entity involved where someone may have some level of power over the other person in terms of being able to prevent them from advancing and getting a raise, for example, or someone has like a professor and a student, the professor may have an ability to fail them in a particular class. Also with discrimination, they're also looking at patterns, so something that's happening more so on an ongoing basis. When we're talking about a hate bias incident, sometimes it could involve student to student, where there's not necessarily someone in a position to take something away from someone or prevent them from advancing, but the behavior is still problematic. And it might also be something that's a one-time thing and not necessarily pervasive in terms of pattern. And so that might be helpful for you to be thinking about as you're looking at an incident and wondering, should we report this to BISS? Should we report this to OCRSM? Ultimately, it may not matter because it will get to the right channel. Both our offices work pretty closely together. And so we ensure that what needs to get where goes where it needs to be. So if we look at the next slide, I want to talk to you about the difference between a hate bias incident and a hate crime. That's really important because a lot of times we get reports and people will say this is a hate crime. And one of the things that we try to do is acknowledge that the incident might be so impactful and so harmful that it can actually feel the level of violation can actually feel like a crime. But the reality is, if we're looking at what the definition allows, it may not actually be a crime. Does that mean that we still can't do something about it? No, but it's important to understand, because I think that when we sort of circle back to folks and say, hey, this is not a crime, I think people, that does not always land well with people, but we also want folks to understand that we are working with some legal definitions in our space as well. So when we're talking about a hate bias incident, these are acts that they have an expression of hate or bias against a particular group because of their identity, right? And so it can be something that is intentional, not intentional. And so, for example, if someone utters, uses non-inclusive language in a classroom, that is definitely something that is motivated by bias, but motivated by prejudice. What it lacks, though, if you look at the screen, is a criminal activity or something that has a crime. And when we're talking about crime, we're looking at what the state and what the police defines as a crime. And therefore, that is a hate bias incident. It is not a hate crime. Again, does that mean that the impact is any less? No. But from a definition, a legal standpoint, That's what we're looking at. Now, if we look at a hate crime, it involves the same prejudice motivation if you look at the screen, but now we're talking about a criminal element. So there's an actual crime, whether it's vandalism, whether it's assault, whether it's battery. So, for example, same situation, someone is using non inclusive language in a classroom, and as they're using that, they get up and they slap me in my face. Well, now we're talking about assault, right? So there's a criminal offense plus the prejudice motivation, and that could actually be looked at as a hate crime. So as you're thinking about hate bias incidents and hate crime, remember with the crime, there has to be some sort of criminal act. I do also want to really stress that our office looks we actually handle both of them similar in terms of impact. We don't offer less or more support to someone because one is a crime and one does not involve a crime, because we recognize that the legality of an action oftentimes has little to do with the impact. So whether or not that crime or criminal offense is there, it can also have harmful and long-lasting impacts. And so before I pass it over to my colleague, I wanted to just show you all this hate pyramid. A lot of the work that we do oftentimes comes back to this. Um, and so when we talk about hate bias incidents, and folks may often say, well, why are you making a big deal out of this? It's not a crime. This person didn't understand what they were saying or doing. If you look at this pyramid and you look at it going up, if you have biased attitudes, which as I gave the example, and it's right here in the pyramid, non-inclusive language that goes unchecked often turns into actual acts, right? So if we don't check the bias attitudes, that can turn into actual action, which can involve name calling and slurs. If we don't check the acts of bias and we don't address it, they can become a pattern and pervasive into discrimination. If we don't check those, as you can see moving up the pyramid, bias motivated violence, genocide, we are trying not to get to the top of the pyramid. And so a lot of our work is really about checking and addressing those bias attitudes, those acts of bias. And now I believe I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Brian.
Thank you, Nejma. Again, Brian Medina, pronouns are Z, here, here's. For those that are joining us, you can participate in the chat with one another. We will leave time at the end. You have your microphone currently muted, but we will leave time at the end for some questions if we have a few moments. So I want to talk a little bit about our current context, right? So Nejma very adequately and eloquently shared what it looks like to differentiate between hate crimes and bias incidents. But looking at our current context, the last few months, we've of course seen a steady rise. And so here's some data from the Anti-Defamation League. They've also done a video series I recommend you check out, talking about how extremists and conspiracy theorists have been blaming Jews in China for creating, spreading, and profiting off the virus. So really seeing that they're using this epidemic, this pandemic, as a means for exhibiting more xenophobia, more racism. Human Rights Watch in late April indicated 1,500 reports. By mid-May, 1,850 reports. I haven't received any more information related to June, but I'm sure that's upwards of 2,000 and beyond in relation to Asians and Asian Americans. On campus specifically, I've been managing over the last couple of months and supporting students and staff and faculty who have been experiencing this. And so if you look prior to the outbreaks, I delineated the data from the rest of the year from August through mid-March. 97% of the reports were derived from in-person. So whether it was in a classroom setting, it was in a residence halls, in the dining hall, somewhere on campus. 46% of those reports involved race and ethnicity. Other reports may be anti-Semitism, other reports may be related to gender, sexuality, but just important to know about half were related to race and ethnicity. But if you look at during the outbreak, over the last 2.5 months, we've seen a large increase of online bias. So social media posts, Zoom bombing, even an increase of folks from local communities sharing that aren't actually associated with UMD, sharing social media posts indicating that an incoming student of ours or a current student of ours with the presence of folks more online, being able to determine that these things are hateful or hurtful for them. The couple of reports that were not online over the last couple of months were actually incidents prior to COVID-19 outbreak. It was just that they reported them a few weeks later. 84% of those reports over the last 2.5 months were related to race and ethnicity. So you see a sharp increase, almost a doubling of the number of reports that relate to race and ethnicity. So some of those potential reasons could be, obviously, for a lot of us, either teleworking or commuting, doing classes online. There's a lot of time and opportunity for folks to use this to exploit online behavior. So whether it is Zoom bombing, whether it is checking social media posts, folks have that isolation, that opportunity to go online, and that feeling of invincibility for folks to create their own screen names or fake names for them to be able to Zoom bomb and to enter a class is a lot more likely because they think that their anonymity creates some sense of protection. We did see at the very beginning, as folks weren't as familiar, maybe for some of you, as you connected on Zoom, weren't as familiar with muting and unmuting. There are also folks who have experienced where they're not sure how to use the technology. This is maybe lead to exploits. So folks who know more about the technology are able to hack into it or be able to use it to their advantage in sharing screens that might be challenging. Accountability is limited online because of the fact that it's sometimes international. And so laws and policies and procedures are a little bit more difficult, and police forces and other agencies have more difficult time tracking things down. There's also an amplification of this hate. And so while we may see on an on-campus setting, folks that may be impacted in a local community, in a dining hall, in a residence hall, in a classroom setting, maybe a dozen or a couple of dozen people, this can amplify to thousands, maybe even millions of individuals online. And so acknowledging that impact could be that much stronger. Specifically for folks of color, I'd mentioned about the percentages moving online, seeing a lot more of an impact. Some of that, of course, is due to the amount of deaths, the cases of COVID-19, folks that are impacted. There's a prevalence to try and blame folks of color and to be able to use this as an exploit to use racism that's already present in our society. Some of the economic challenges and recession, recessive concerns have certainly impacted more service level jobs disproportionately for workers of color. And as we all now well know, because it's been highly publicized, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, so many others who have then been killed and impacted by this in recent weeks and months, folks now have a much higher notoriety and presence, and also backlash for folks who disagree with that solidarity amongst other folks. There is, I don't want to neglect the fact that there's continued xenophobia and racism to the PETA communities, despite our focus for Black Lives Matter, which is absolutely essential. I want you to also know that there have still continued to be reports for PETA, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Desi American communities throughout this time as a result of the pandemic. So Nejma talked a little about differentiating. I wanted us to practice a little bit, thinking about this and kind of exploring what this might look like. And so maybe in the chat window, if you want to share some of this for yourselves, just kind of explore what you might be thinking. What might this be as an incident or a hate crime? So in this case, a faculty member gives a Zoom class lecture, of course now being online, where they claim that people of color disproportionately seek welfare assistance because they are brought up in a parasitic culture, which denigrates work, stable families, and personal responsibility. Take a few moments and maybe explore in the chat what your thoughts might be. Is that a hate crime or hate bias incident? Nejma, if you don't mind, if you could check that while I'm also going through the screens to see what the responses are, since I can't see the chat window at the moment. See a few people jumping on in the chat. Fantastic. "17 responses, fantastic." Nejma, what seems to be the general consensus amongst those in the chat? Nejma, you're still muted. It looks like Nejma is having some microphone difficulties. But for everybody, this would constitute a hate bias incident, right? So based on what Nejma shared earlier, that this doesn't have a criminal intent, it's very insensitive, it's very concerning. There's certainly an impact to the class members beyond even maybe this class that may be seeking after some support from our office and from others to seek guidance on what to do. And so we may involve, Nejma and I may have conversations with the professor, may involve conversations with individuals or the class as a whole, but just understand this would be a hate bias incident, not a hate crime. So I had several scenarios. If we had more time, I'd love to break us out into small groups to be able to do this. Since this is being recorded, you can certainly go back and review each of these scenarios one by one. I wanted for our own benefit just to kind of look through the first couple, very similar in tone from what we just discussed. So the first scenario is several Asian American students receive daily texts from unknown numbers saying things like, "Go home and take the Wuhan virus with you," and quote, "This is America, we won't wear masks like you dirty," and then expletive. I left the expletive out. So all of these are hate bias incidents. They're not necessarily hate crimes, but they also vary in their level of impact, depending on the number of students that are in this, depending on the identities of the individuals who are receiving this messaging. Of course, at this time, we're seeing that there's a heavy prevalence of this for scenario one. This is actually not a direct quote, but pretty close to what students did experience recently. So scenario two, again, just one more. Unknown individual connects to an online Zoom class shouting racial slurs to the audience while wearing a hooded mask. Before leaving, they change to a custom background filled with swastikas and a large Confederate flag. Again, because of the prevalence of folks going onto Zoom and maybe not necessarily having passwords or maybe not knowing the Zoom platform well enough, folks are maybe able to share their screens or to show their video in ways that in the past we just never had to worry about as much. And so this, again, is a very hurtful. This is also very similar to a situation that did happen here about a month and a half ago. And so understanding that the impact of the students, impact of others that may need support, including having conversations with the professor to try and navigate the tools that is at their disposal in terms of removing people from the class, blocking folks from being able to share their screens, et cetera. So I won't go through the rest of the scenarios. Hopefully you're able to do that in your own time, but each of these hopefully are good guidance. They are very similar to what we actually have experienced throughout the year, some verbatim, some just more an illusion. So for a lot of you, you may be wondering, how do you report this? So in terms of logistics and practical terms, our main website, our ODI website, Bias Incident Support Services, on the top right corner, report a bias incident as pronounced as it can be. We also have it on, if you dig further within the websites, there are a multitude of areas to do this. In the top right corner, you can report a hate bias incident. And I'm walking you through just what the form looks like. The form may change over time, but this form, just putting in the information, the date, the time, the location, so that we can know, potentially we can navigate if there are other folks on campus that we can partner with to gain support. Some of that is helpful based on the date and the location. And then also the identities of those impacted. So what's the nature of the incident? What are the identities that are being targeted? Maybe you don't know all of the identities that are being targeted or the intention behind it, but at least, from either you being the witness or you being the person experiencing this, certainly may have something in mind to be able to suggest so that we can navigate maybe getting different partners involved in this process, especially as Nejma mentioned previously, because some of our partners work with OCRSM with discrimination or with sexual misconduct, then we can work with folks if there is something that more rises to that level. We put a narrative and description. We have a big box there. It may only be a little bit for somebody to share. Involved parties, if somebody knows, if they're able to know the individual, they may not be able to put that information in there is helpful for us in terms of follow through. We also have a box that I did not share at the bottom that if somebody has a graphic or picture, especially with online, we have folks with social media posts, somebody can screenshot that or receive something via text, they can snap that and be able to include that as a part of this report. That enables us to have the information immediately accessible to us and to be able to work with our team members to support that student and staff. So this is what our current protocol looks like when we do receive a report, either it's from UMPD or from ODI, BISS receives a report, what we do from it. So we access that, we receive it, we acknowledge the complaint, we make sure that the resources are available. So we respond with not just initial messaging to indicate that we received it, but certainly other additional resources. If it is counseling center, if it is OCRSM, if it is Office of Student Conduct, making sure that folks know that we are here for them, that we're here to listen. Often what I'll do, especially on an online basis, is just connect with a student or a staff member or faculty member one-on-one, just to gauge from their own words, because sometimes writing it out may look different than from a verbal conversation, just to show that sympathy, that compassion. Somebody going through this needs that additional hand, and especially as we're working virtually, can be particularly difficult. So we respond and report. We often get involved, the hate bias response team. We coordinate with others for programming, for response, and then we inform the community. So for those that aren't familiar, we actually have an incident log that gets updated regularly throughout every week, every couple of weeks when we do receive reports. Once we have something that we can substantiate, then we put that onto the log so that all the community members within UMD, those that have UMD email addresses, can access that log. That's again on our BISS website. And that gives us some accountability. It gives us some trends and some data for us to work with as reporting toward the end of the year. But it also allows folks to be able to see if there are concerning behaviors, if there's consistent issues in a specific identity or a certain area of campus, then we can certainly do more education and more support for those areas as well. So moving more toward response, I'd mentioned the hate bias response team is made up of many members: counseling center, UMPD, resident life, OCRSM, Office of Student Conduct. So we meet regularly every 2 weeks. We also have additionally added this past spring and into this fall will continue a student advisory group on top of this current team, the staff team. And so what this team really does is reviews all these situations. Beyond Nejmani is a small office. We also have other team members who may have additional ideas, additional resources, and especially as a student advisory group, able to really resonate with other students and what their identities and what may be trends for them they're seeing online or they're seeing amongst their peers. The language is very important for us to keep up to tabs with and supporting one another. And so with this kind of larger community of support, we then also disseminate different resources. Sometimes we, after I do the initial intake and support, it may be that some other community members get involved for maybe a facilitated dialogue or facilitated forum, which I talk about in this next slide. So educational programming, referrals. Sometimes if it does rise to the level of discrimination or a conduct violation, we do involve others as well for that. And then making sure that folks get additional support care. What I will continue to do via email, via Zoom now, in person, as we get back in person at some point, is doing that one-on-one follow-through. For most of the student, staff, and faculty I've talked with, the initial intake is difficult enough to be able to process, but to at least acknowledge that there's somebody there along the way that makes sure to check in, to ensure that as triggers might be present or more updates, that it is that ongoing follow-through is important for each individual who might be impacted. And maybe that's an individual one-on-one, or if it's a larger restorative practice and maybe a healing space, a circle, some kind of group meeting may be helpful. I mentioned in terms of our online responses looks a little bit different because we're not doing this in a physical location, but having these restorative conversations, these one-on-ones, these check-ins, small group healing spaces have all been essential for our members to feel validated, to feel like even though that impact has been immense for them, that they know that they're not alone. Sometimes for individuals, and so I've spoken with several individuals who have been the one impacting others, not necessarily the ones impacted, just to navigate not necessarily any kind of consequences. That's not really what our office is about. Our office is more about restorative practice. But in that restoration, there's sometimes this homework or information that we can share with professors, students, staff that are impacting others, that even if their intentions were they're well-intentioned, that the impact was still strong. And so maybe some of this information of understanding anti-racism, instead of just not being racist, or videos and articles and books, things that may be able to facilitate for oneself some reflection, some additional support as they are trying to demonstrate that their intentions are good. Now they're putting that into action. And so again, that's been throughout the last several months a very useful tool. So improving internal collaborations. Last week, Nejma and I worked with OSC, Office of Student Conduct, and some other folks to really develop a strategy with how do we maintain the semblance of what we're doing in terms of our workload and support for students, staff, and faculty, but also acknowledging that we're getting a lot more external reports. And so folks that are not UMD specific, and maybe from another school, maybe an alumni, maybe somebody else that may be outside that doesn't necessarily have a direct link perhaps Maybe it's, you know, just a community member in the local community that sees something online, that trying to provide them support, but not the same level of support as we were for internal. So making sure that folks that are students, staff, and faculty are really getting the additional resources from us internally, but that the external are still receiving a response, acknowledging that it is an impact that is more global. Often it's like you all on this call, that campus partners clarifying who we are, what we do, and providing some options. And so for folks to be more aware of and to be more centered on what does it mean to have a hate crime or bias incident, or what resources might go to which area, it can be confusing for a lot of folks. And so clarifying that, but also acknowledging that there are some challenges in free speech and hate speech. And so navigating those conversations, just a shameless plug, next month we'll be doing another webinar specifically focused on free speech in virtual settings. So ensuring that folks have those resources, acknowledging that this is a very nuanced conversation for a lot of folks as they're approaching more online activities. We did create, and credit to Allison Dickinson from our office for creating the GRACE model. So we wanted to make sure that there are resources available for everybody. And so this GRACE model is just another visual impact to show the circle. It's not necessarily a direct circle. It's kind of more, you know, providing the grace for the letters as well, but allowing folks to kind of see this, and within those are embedded links. We have that actually on our online website in a PDF format. But remember to centering the voices of those that are impacted by hate and bias online. So folks that, you know, as you're trying to do your best to support your colleagues, you know, friends, other staff members, students, even those not associated with the university, making sure that they are getting those resources. So we've included a lot of links to make sure that we have that, as well as our own resource for folks. So understanding this impact, I'm going to pass it back to Nejma to be able to talk a little about trauma-informed response and ensuring that we can really, again, center those voices in an effective way. Let me see about unmuting. It looks like Nejma is muted. Are you able to unmute,
Thank
Nejma?
you. Yes, I'm
Great.
sorry. I was muted and I could not speak earlier. So
Thank you,
thank
Nejma.
you. um, Before I talk about the last couple of slides, I do want to say that I have been getting your questions. I am collecting all of them, and we're going to do our best to respond to all of them. I also want to name, because I think it's really important that uh, we give the proper credit, particularly to people of color. Brian, I know that you mentioned to credit Allison for the GRACE model, but I also want to be clear that that was Brian and myself are doing, not because I want to take credit, but because I think people of color deserve to be credited for their work. Allison put it together in terms of the final touches, but to be clear, that was our work. And I think that's really important to name in this space and time that we're in. Moving on to the signs of trauma after hate bias incidents. One of the things that is important for us to talk about, because a lot of folks who make reports when we're engaging with them, they'll begin to describe some of the things that they're seeing with their students or with their staff or with other faculty people. And so as they're talking, oftentimes I'll say, that sounds like trauma to me. And the person is often like, wow, you know, now that you're saying that, I could see that. I didn't think about it this way. And so it's really important for us to talk about what are some of the things that you might want to look for, especially, you know, if you're meeting with folks via Zoom, if you're seeing these things happening, that you don't credit it to be something else, and that you recognize that this in fact might be trauma that's happening. So one of them is sort of the re-experiencing of what might be happening, of the trauma. And so when there are folks who, let's say, a racial slur um, might have been written on their door, or on their in their office space or whatever, sometimes even when they're out of that space, they continue to see this racial slur, and it's almost of this everywhere they go, they're seeing it and they're like experiencing the very same thing that they saw that they experienced the first time. And so it's this re experiencing of the actual event and being triggered by various things that might remind them of what is happening. A lot avoidance or denial. So many times when we meet students, faculty, or staff, and we're checking in with them, almost everyone says I'm fine or I'm doing okay or nothing is wrong. And we very gently oftentimes have to kind of dig deeper and push back a little bit, because we know that some of them are not fine, right? And maybe they don't have language to describe what they're feeling, but definitely seeing a lot of denial, a lot of anger and frustration, particularly the way it comes out. What we see is, if we if folks want a particular action to be taken and we're unable to do that, a lot of anger and frustration, and we really try to balance that out to know that while some of it is coming from a place of this is what we want to see and this is not happening, but some of it is also from that frustration of not being seen and heard and acknowledged. And so we really try to spend a lot of time doing that. um Negative changes in beliefs. So, I think just for the last couple of months, just a lot of negative changes in beliefs about around leadership in the world, leadership in the country, leadership, just across college campuses, which is normal, a normal response that you would see, just sort of feeling like no one is doing anything to listen to me or help me. Um, and I think in this space, sort of just not not wanting to be connected and really just kind of retreating. And so, we've seen so many times and even heard, when we talk to people, they're not responding to my emails. They're not responding to my requests to meet or to talk over the phone or for the Zoom meeting. I think recognizing that now we're in a space where a lot of people are not okay, right? Because of various things. And on top of that, something traumatic happened to them in the form of a hate bias incident. And so I say this because I hear people say, you know, the student is not engaging with me, or the student is not being compliant, or the staff person doesn't really seem to want my help. And I think that we need to be reframing the way that we're looking at these responses, because it's not that, is that a lot of people might be going through their own trauma. So I want to offer you that so that you can begin to think about behaviors that you're seeing through the framework and through a trauma informed lens rather than something else. So the next slide. um, just a couple of things, and this could be what you might offer to other folks or to do for yourself as well, right? If you have been impacted by a hate bias incident or know someone who has been, these are some trauma informed tips for virtual setting. Um, so I think one of the things is really to make sure that we are acknowledging and recognizing just all of the things that are happening this at this time and place, right? So being disconnected, the economic hardships, all of the other concerns that we have, and it's important to acknowledge, because I think it allows us to have grace for ourselves and grace for other people as we're thinking about they are behaving this way not just because of this one particular incident, but because of all the other mitigating circumstances that might be happening. Um, Encouraging folks to find safe online environments and finding online communities with other groups, whether it's at UMD or other places, um, as much as possible. And if the person wants, if you can use video to connect so that people can have that human interaction and see a familiar face. Also, it's really important to unplug, right? And know when you have to just get off. We hear often people talk about feeling zoomed out, um, and that is real. Or some people not wanting to put on their cameras and getting some pushback around that. Um, if we want to care for others and we want to be trauma informed, I think we just have to allow time and space for that to take place. So in the next slide, again, these are things you can be thinking about for yourself or things that you can offer to others if they have been impacted by a hate bias incident. So again, finding a balance between online and offline, making sure that you're encouraging people to schedule breaks. If you have employees who are coming and who have been impacted, making sure you're saying that, of course, going outdoors as much as you can. um, we talked about a virtual support system. Again, offering the person who might be coming to you just a time to check in, maybe outside of talking about this incident, right? Just to hang out and to spend time together would be really important. So those are just some self-care. I don't need to get into all of it, but I think the message here is when something happens, people often experience trauma, especially in this national context. And we want them to take care of themselves, and we want to encourage you to encourage them to care for themselves as well. The other thing is, uh, we have started talking a lot about community care because sometimes people don't even have the will, the energy to even care for themselves, to engage in self care. And so sometimes it really takes you, as their colleague, as their supervisor, to say, here's what I can do for you, and here's what I am going to do for you, and thinking about it in terms of community care. So here are some resources. We'll share this in terms of understanding hate bias. And then we have some community resources here for folks that are wanting to get engaged in some collective action, um, fighting systemic racism, fighting hate bias on a national level. These are some ways to get involved, and they can also be a way that people engage in their own self-care by giving back. This can be some things that folks can do as well. So we have a bunch of questions that we need to get to, so I do want to make sure that we spend our last 15 minutes doing that. So, and I'll ask the question, and Brian or I can answer it, or we can both answer it. So, one of the first questions is, what is considered non-inclusive language in the classroom? Brian, did you want to tackle that?
It's a good question, and obviously language changes, and so I recognize that for some folks on the call, some of this is maybe lack of familiarity with some of the terms that may be used. I know that over the course of my own career, some of the language around, for me, LGBT development as an openly queer person has changed. And so some of this is based on the impact on the individual. So if somebody comes to you, or if somebody indicates that they want to report about non-inclusive language, it's based on their experience of that. They may be able to articulate why and the tonality that might be there. So it could be related to race, it could be about gender, sexuality, it could be about any of these different dynamics and identities. But if it's meant and used in a derogatory sense as a term to put down, that often may be the non-inclusive language. Or for me, in terms of the trans community, making sure we use broader they, using pronouns that they are honored, rather than simply assuming a binary. So that could be one example.
Yes, I think Brian is right. And sometimes the microaggressions could be that it may not even be a slur that is involved. I think one of the things that we dealt with a lot, well, I guess this past semester, and I could talk about the classroom setting, for example. So making disparaging comments related to someone, the group that they belong to. So, for example, saying things like, you know, I'm surprised that you are so smart given that you were raised by a single parent. Something like that, right? So you're not necessarily saying a slur. You're not necessarily saying something that's homophobic in that space, but it is a microaggression because of the comments. And so I want to name that not only do we get things that are blatant, whether it's a racial slur or homophobic slur, but it could be a comment like what I just described. The other question, which might be similar, is what is considered non-inclusive language in the classroom? So non-inclusive language could be not using someone's pronouns. It could be using racial slurs. It could be using homophobic slurs. Anything that makes someone feel not included and not having a sense of belonging in that space. There's actually a non-inclusive language policy that should be coming out that provides some guidance around what we should be saying in and out of the classroom. But those are some examples. And what I talked about are examples of what we get a lot in our space at BISS. Brian, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, there's one example that I know that you and I have supported a student through, and that's around disabilities and accommodations. And so
Yes,
sometimes non-inclusive, it's not just about the terminology. Again, for me,
yes,
LGBT language may change, but for somebody, the assumption that everybody's operating under the sameness around their abilities. And so where a professor or a student may have interactions and talk about accommodations, not to assume that somebody has a certain ability or a disability for that matter. So having conversations around what is needed for somebody toward exams or tutoring or note taking or on any of the different accommodations that somebody might request, that making sure that folks don't see lesser than and more so different than. I think that that's something to really make sure to show equity. It's not about somebody being less or without, but more so that there are differing learning styles and different learning abilities.
yeah. I mean, and I'm glad that you brought that up, Brian. And I may go off topic a little bit here, but one of the things, and we didn't, I don't think we put this in the trends, but one of the things that we definitely saw an increase of in terms of targeted identity was with folks with disabilities. And I think one of the reasons that that came up is that what we realize is what worked, the accommodations that worked for individuals in a in-person setting no longer worked in a virtual setting. And so that meant that there needed to be some tweak and some work around what folks were getting in an in-person versus virtual. And there was like some pushback um, with people asking for more accommodations or different accommodations rather in a virtual setting, and some not understanding that yes, I get that these are my accommodations, whether we're talking about student or faculty. However, now we're in a virtual setting, and so that needs to change. And so we did definitely see at least bias as it relates to individuals with a disability coming to us. So thank you for sharing that. The other question is, do we need to be direct witnesses to report something? No, you do not need to be a direct witness. In fact, when you go on a form, it asks what is your role and if you were a third party, and that's fine. Um, in this, from the same person, the next question: if someone tells us something that happened but doesn't want to report it because of fear of retaliation, is there a place we can log it so that the university can identify problem areas? Yeah. So this is the thing. if you report something to us, and we get this all the time, if you report something to us, if there is a fear of retaliation, we don't necessarily have to act on it or reach out on it or do anything with it. But we do ask folks to still report it to us because it helps us to understand the trends. It helps us to understand what the problem areas are. So the place that you would report it is to us. And of course, we'll have that conversation if you're saying, we really don't want this to go anywhere, or we really just want you to acknowledge it and note it. And we can do that absolutely. Because what we find is you may report something that involves a particular person, and we may have gotten 7 reports or 2 reports with that same person, and you may not know that. Now we have something that we possibly could take action on because you are not the only person that reported, but we don't know if you don't report. So we still encourage you. And if you don't want to take action, that's fine. But again, it helps us to understand the trends, and as you noted in your question, so we can identify problem areas. How does this relate to requirements of faculty to report? So I'm not exactly sure if this is what you're asking, but if you're asking if this is mandated reporting like some of the others, this is not mandated reporting. It is highly recommended and strongly recommended, but there is not necessarily a mandate here. Next question.
With the OCRSM, I'm guessing it's the Title IX.
Yes, as with other entities, correct.
Yep.
Next question, what accountability measures are there in place for students who commit hate bias incidents? I can speak to this and then I'll let Brian chime on. A couple different things, and it depends where and in what setting. So one of the examples given there was lose a job. That could be an option that happens. Being expelled could be an option. Being suspended could be an option. Having an educational sanction where there's not necessarily you're being suspended or anything, but you may have to do some training or some education type of things. What we do is we work very closely, and since this question is about students, we work very closely with the Office of Student Conduct. And much like when we were talking about something has to be a crime in order for it to be some sanction or action, the action of the student also has to be in some way, shape, or form be a violation of the student code of conduct, in addition to having that hate bias element to it. So we work really closely. Sometimes it does not fall, the action might be problematic and be harmful, but it may not necessarily be a violation of the student code of conduct. What we have done in those instances is we may still ask the student to come in for a conversation along with the Office of Student Conduct. Sometimes that in and of itself can have an impact on the student. And the other thing that we do a lot of is what we call restorative justice or restorative practices, right? Where we bring the person who has done the harm and those who've been impacted in the same space. And what that really, we see that as a form of accountability, because the person who has done the harm really is sitting in the same space with that person and really has to hear, this is what you've done, this is how it's impacted to me, and let's talk about how we can make things better. We have found that not only has that been powerful for the folks who have been impacted, but it also has been a lot of teaching moment and a learning moment for those who've done the harm. Brian, you could chime on and add on to talking about that.
Absolutely. So I won't go into great detail about the individuals involved just for their own privacy, but I had a recent circumstance where I did exactly what Nejma described, and having these 2 individuals in the space. It was actually virtual, so it's even more nuanced than what we normally would do in person. But having had pre-meetings with me, with each of them, the person impacted and the person impacting, having private conversations just to navigate some of that, asking questions, answering questions initially, but then being able to facilitate that restorative conversation where both are able to share where their perspective was, the intent and impact conversation we continue to have around this. It's empowering. And for many of the folks that are impacting others, it isn't intentional. It's, you know, a word that they used out of turn, or maybe biases that are now represented in their actions. And so for them to hear directly from a source, now in some ways it can be draining for that person impacted, depending on who it is, but it also can be empowering to show that there is some level of accountability, there is some level of feedback, and you hopefully see that the growth is then followed up from that. So at least it's documented, it's having a good conversation. And I've found that, you know, in this specific circumstance, but overall, for folks to hear, hey, this is what I'm hearing from this is how I was impacted by something you said or did, that comes off a much different scenario than somebody calling somebody racist, sexist, homophobic, all these isms, because that feels very defensive. But if you hear the phrases, terms, actions that are taken, here's how it impacted me, it's not a targeting at you, it's saying, here's how I'm feeling, here's how I'm processing that. I think what it does is it bridges boundary, or bridges some common ground, and make sure that folks feel like they're validated as the person who may be impacted, but also the person who maybe have said something out of turn.
And one of the things that we stress, and one of the things that I also want to just encourage you to do, sometimes as we're responding to hate bias incidents, and I've seen it happen over and over on our campus and in different spaces, we really want to make sure that we are taking action, that we're sanctioning, that we're being punitive, and all of that. And I think that I get that and I understand that. But oftentimes, what ends up happening is that we censor the people who are doing the harm rather than censoring those who have been harmed. So we spend a lot of time and energy. How are we going to dismiss this person? How are we going to sanction this person? How are we going to get rid of them? And I'm not saying that that is not something that we should be doing, but oftentimes it's to the detriment of not making sure the very people who have been harmed, that they're being censored. And I know that because they've said that to Brian and us over and over and over. Like, that's great that they're spending all that time and energy focusing on what they could do to the person that harmed me, but what about me, right? And I think even in those instances where we have found that we cannot make someone lose their job, we cannot suspend someone, because we have invested the time and energy in centering those who have been harmed and impacted, 100% of the time, I would say, and maybe I'm just exaggerating here, but it feels like 100.
99.
People are like, thank you. We feel seen, we feel heard, and we feel like we've mattered. This may not have ended the way that we wanted it to originally, but all of our time and energy was really focused on kind of figuring out how we censor them. And sometimes that has to do with reshaping the conversation and really making sure we're making it about them, because everyone who comes into a space is always like, I want that person fired, I want this person gone. And what we have to say is, okay, I hear that, and even when that person is gone or fired, are you going to be okay? Because there have been instances where, sure, someone was fired from their job and you don't have to see them again, but you still have a lot of work that you have to do in terms of the impact. And that, what I'm sort of describing, is a bit of a paradigm shift, but I would encourage you all to really think about it in from that framework. Let me just get to the last couple of questions because I know we're kind of running out of time here. But is there a training module available for instructors and TAs to prepare for the online landscape? Yes, we do have a training. If you go online, you can request to the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. You'll see BISS, and we have a training request form. You can request a training for your department and for instructors and TAs in your specific area, and we're happy to talk about preventing and addressing hate bias incidents in online spaces. The other question was, how can we best contribute to an anti-racist online environment? We have a lot of resources. We will make for that very same thing. We will make sure that we also attach it when we share this PowerPoint, which goes to the next question, can you send us the slides? Yes. Do you have any guidance? And this is the last question, I believe. Do you have any guidance for UMD staff who are hosting virtual events for the campus community on reacting to comments with hate bias content if something were to happen? I think we do when we talk about the grace model, which is kind of, I don't know that we went through it too much here, but it does have guidance for hosting virtual events. And it also has links on the actual model itself that will let you get more information and speaks exactly on how do you react to comments with hate bias content if it's happening during a live event. If it does not, we certainly have materials that we could share. But I do think that this GRACE model, which speaks to responding to online incidents, virtual incidents, could probably answer that question. So there's a lot more that we could have gotten into. I'm sure there are lots of questions that we did not answer or get to, but our information should be on the last slide. So if you have any questions, please email myself or Brian. We are more than happy to answer whatever questions come your way. This has also been a moving target and an evolving space for us. Information is changing, new trends are happening. So we are also, as this is happening, also trying to keep up. We're also, again, working within certain legal parameters as well. So we also have to be thinking about that. Free speech is one thing that we come up against that we did not necessarily address here, but it is definitely a huge issue in how we do our work and what we can and cannot do. So yeah, I think that's all for now. If you all, again, need any other information, feel free to reach out. And I'll leave it to Brian for the last words.
Thank you, Nejma. So yes, for folks that are still in the call, I will absolutely, for anybody who is registered, share along with the survey link, the PowerPoint link as well, so that folks have this, and those are all those resources and links that are embedded within. You can use those to your leisure. And then again, the GRACE model, I'll attach that as well. So we have all of the resources we could possibly share in the one setting. So thank you very much for attending this webinar. I really appreciate it. Again, a shameless plug in July. I believe it's July 15th. We'll be doing another webinar for Webinar Wednesdays at 1 o'clock, and that will be focused on free speech in virtual settings. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you're well. Be safe.